welcome to Abstracts. This week, Star Wars.
The core of the Force. I mean, you got the dark side, the light side. One is selfless, one is selfish. And you want to keep them in balance. What happens when you go to the dark side is it goes out of balance and you get really selfish and you forget about everybody and you ultimately lead yourself, because when you get selfish, you get stuff, or you want stuff. And when you want stuff and you get stuff, then you are afraid somebody's going to take it away from you. Whether it's a person or a thing or a particular pleasure, experience. Once you become afraid that somebody's going to take it away from you, or you're going to lose it, then you start to become angry. Especially if you're losing it. And that anger leads to hate. And hate leads to suffering. Mostly on the part of the person who's selfish. Because you spend all your time being afraid of losing everything you've got, instead of actually living.
So what gin are we drinking?
I don't know, mate. Ungava.
Ungava.
Yeah, so gin made with indigenous Canadian herbs.
Indigenous Canadian herbs.
Yeah, bring out your senses from hibernation. Yeah, so it's from Ungava Bay, a vast territory in the Canadian Arctic. Unspoilt, sparkling landscapes. And apparently fantastic gin. So
Why is it yellow?
Why is it yellow? Good question. Might just be.
It
might
does
just be the
look
bottle.
a bit urine-y.
Oh, now you've said it. I can't get it out of my eyes, out of my head. What is this? Made with rare botanicals.
It's like you've come out of hibernation and had a piss.
Yeah, your kidneys are pretty jacked.
Yeah.
They're
You're
pretty
like,
backed
gotta
up.
get it out.
Very dehydrated. No, yeah.
Well, it doesn't taste like piss. It tastes much nicer than...
That's one hell of a review. Doesn't taste like piss. Doesn't taste like piss. Ungava. I must say, trying to get that off the shelf when you order something like Ungava, sort of looking at you to say, what is this? I haven't seen it before, but it tastes very nice.
Nice
Very
bottle too.
Nice bottle.
Cap.
I know, that always gets
Nice
you.
logo. It's very... It's quite Swedish design.
It kind of is. It does. It's very Swedish. This logo has something very Swedish about it. It's very minimalist.
Yeah, exactly. And symbols on top. Symbolism. Nice. So how you doing, Matthew? How's things?
Yeah, good.
Good to be back.
It's always good to be back. Always good to be back here, talking about psychology and history, as it's always seems to have been.
Well, actually, this episode could be the scariest history we do. Because, it could be scrutinised quite heavily by a fan base. So,
yeah, well,
I intend to get it wrong, actually.
Absolutely. The more hate mail, the better.
This is it.
This will be the most controversial topic we ever hit.
Absolutely.
We can hit all the topics.
We could talk about everything that's driving people crazy nowadays, but nothing drives people crazy as much as...
Star Wars.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Exactly. If you want to twist someone's nipple...
Here we go. Let's start strong.
Yeah.
Love Jar Jar Binks.
Right. So did I, actually, back in the day. Yeah. But I was
fan.
young and naive.
You know what?
I didn't know what social ignorance and was.
I've gone through phases with Jar Jar Binks.
Right.
Loved him at the time, then I grew up, and then I came back around to it. Social ignorance I get, But at the same time, the actor, he's had a terrible time of it. So, I go through waves with Jar Jar.
Yeah.
I mean, have you seen the behind the scenes of George Lucas watching the very first Star Wars, as in The Phantom Menace?
No, I haven't.
No, he sort of watches it behind the scenes with the producers, and I think the editor might be in there. And at the end, he sort of just breathes a sigh. He goes, I might have gone a bit far in a few places, he said. And they specifically call out Jar Jar Binks, and he goes, well, we can't remove him because we've baked him into every plot point. So we can't even edit him out, because George Lucas always says, you save it in the edit.
Right.
George Lucas actually, by trade, he says he's more of an editor than anything else, and him and his I think wife of the time in the original trilogies, they really apparently saved the film in the edits. And he said, we put Jar Jar Binks in everything, in every twist and turn. So love him or hate him, but even Lucas was stuck with him.
It did lead to fan theories that Jar Jar Binks was the ultimate emperor, didn't it?
Darth Jar Jar.
Yeah, Darth Jar Jar. Yeah. But episode 1, it's just kind of racist from the off. Because it starts on that spaceship and there's them two characters. Who are they?
They're part of the Trade Federation.
Yeah, they're part of the Trade Federation, but they're basically Chinese.
They are.
They've got Chinese accents. They are like alien Chinese people.
Yeah, and
It's misguided from episode 1. if you think about it, like from this first scene, it's
the very first
Jar Jar
scene.
Binks is the least of the worries at this point.
Yeah,
you know?
I can't remember anything like that from the original trilogy. Can you? I might have got something wrong here, but I don't remember anything like that.
No, I guess not.
Somehow he got worse as he got older. Oh, well, actually.
Well, there's lots of puppets in the original series, you know. But just the voices are just so caricatured and ridiculous. It's like that is just so obviously a stereotypical Chinese accent.
Yeah.
You know?
The Trade Federation, we're going to... Yeah.
This is it. But them ones... You see, the thing is, I hated those 1 to 3. And I still do, to a degree, like when they first came out.
In what sense?
Oh, because they're really... They're bad, man. They're bad.
Yeah?
They're bad.
Well, in what way? In every way?
In a lot of ways, they're
okay.
really bad.
Well, we're gonna butt heads on this one.
It's like, because there's... The actors have got nothing to go on, so it's really... The acting's really bad, because it's just green screens. The entire thing is green screens.
Yeah.
And so they're all just kind of... I don't know what's around me.
It's true. It's true. I mean, and also, Lucas isn't known for his great dialogue.
Well, you see, this is it. I thought the scripts are great. I don't know why, but I do. Like,
really?
Yeah, like I think the scripts are the best things about them first 3,
Well,
1 to 3.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, Lucas has this thing where he makes it almost Shakespearean. Because,
It's
obviously...
super, like, economic. It's all like there's a trade negotiation going on, and there's, like... It's like Brexit. It's like you drop in intergalactic Brexit.
I think it's great for kids.
Yeah, it's
Honestly,
pretty deep.
I was all over those trade laws from an early age. But, I thought they were all right. For me, the fight choreo saved it. The choreography, the lightsaber battles, for me, really got me going.
Yeah.
Because, I ended up doing martial arts. That's what I love. And I was doing things like stick fighting. I was doing knife fighting. So Kali and Eskrima. And I just really respected it. I just couldn't believe that actors, it's not their life's passion. And they were incredible. I mean, I know it's all choreographed and everything else by people who really knew what they were doing. It was based on kendo and all of this. But I loved watching the fights.
Yeah, the fights were pretty good. It's just most of the rest was not,
Yeah.
Because the thing is, if you're going to have a really, like, deep scene with some... Because they're good actors, man. It's like Liam Neeson's in there. There's some great, like, British actors, too.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's like, if you're going to have scenes with trade negotiations and some politics, is it really necessary to have these on a green screen? Could you not have built a 6 set and so, like, those conversations actually have some gravitas? And then the other thing is, at the end of the last episode, when he comes out and he's become Darth Vader, and he finds out that his girlfriend's dead, and he's just like, no.
Yeah.
Just come on, mate.
No, have you heard the French version? No, genuinely. So the French dub of that, he's actually got a really tortured scream. It's the scream they should have used in every single one, but it's only on the French version.
Really?
Yes, this really tortured scream, and you go, that's Darth Vader. That's how he should sound. You would imagine it would be different because it's French, but no, it's
They sent it to France, and the French people watched it, and they were like, no, this is unacceptable. And they just, like, re-recorded it themselves.
Yeah, this is not tragic enough.
Yeah.
And so, it was... so here we go. We've already succumbed to the original trilogy of just doing accents. And
So what's your favourite out of the new ones?
the favourite of the new
7
ones...
to 9,
Got to be honest, it's got to be for me the most recent one, The Rise of Skywalker.
Right, interesting choice.
I do think so. 7, I thought, I get it. I get why they've done it. I get from a corporate perspective why they've done it. I understand that. The Last Jedi, not a fan.
Mm-hmm.
Especially looking at the fight choreography. I am by no means qualified to talk about films and media, but I am relatively qualified to talk about.
Of course you are.
Fight
It's
choreo.
all personal preference.
Yeah. Not necessarily with that fight choreography. I mean, you're meant to be aiming for people, and you're disappearing knives, so I edited out.
What fight are you talking about?
You know the throne room scene. Watch that on slow motion. You'll see weapons disappear.
Because that is one of my favourite scenes.
Oh my god! Literally, they edit out. They paint out in post the knives because there's situations where Rey would have just got chopped up, and they go, yeah, she's fucked up there. Let's just paint that out in post. And there's situations where you'll just see them aiming for the weapons. That's one of the big no-nos, Right?
Oh,
It's
I
like,
didn't know that. I'll have
everyone's
to watch
just-
that again.
Yeah, you watch it again, and it's especially the slow-mo breakdowns.
Yeah.
But anyway, what's your favourite one of the new ones?
The Last Jedi. Yeah.
Okay.
It's controversial because all the Star Wars lovers hate The Last Jedi. But I think the worst one is the newest one, funnily enough.
Okay. Talk me through it, because I'm going to preface this by saying I reckon the reason you like The Last Jedi, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is because this is Rian Johnson, and he's known for challenging film genres. He takes a genre and he turns it on its head. So
Right.
it is much more of an arty-farty film. I feel like...
Arty-farty?
Not arty-farty, but I sort of look at it and I go, I see what he was doing there. He was trying to be challenging, provocative, as they say. provocative and challenging. And I was I reckon that's probably why you liked it.
I do think that... Right, it's not that it was challenging and provocative. Yeah, there were bits like that I did like. I think Rian Johnson's just a better director than J.J. Abrams. Like, I just really do. I think J.J. Abrams is a really good TV director that made it big. You know what I mean? And he gets a lot of props, but I just think, I think The Last Jedi is funnier, and it's more in line with the old trilogy, because the old trilogy was swashbuckling. And in The Last Jedi, every character has something to do. Every single one of them. In the newest one, we didn't even need Finn by the end of the film. Finn basically has no story. If you look at Finn's character
Finn was
arc,
pointless in The Last Jedi as well.
Doesn't have a story.
He
No,
was
but
totally
at
pointless.
least there was a story there that he did, and at least
They
there
let
was
they set some horses free.
Yeah, exactly. And then nice, nice little themes, of let's not hurt the animals running through The Last Jedi.
It was themes. There were themes. I mean,
nice
there were
themes.
very identifiable.
But I thought it
themes.
was funny, and I thought when they were stood on the bridge in the Attack Walker, when Luke's down there, and they're just shouting "Fire everything!" I just thought it was brilliant. Really
You liked that?
funny, tongue in cheek, awesome. Yeah, exactly what it should have been. But I think it just kind of took itself a bit too seriously in the new one. And the thing is that it just peters out. If you look at, say, what Marvel did with the Avengers, right, over the course of, say, 4 films, right, and you look at Endgame and the finale of Endgame, it lasts, how long does it last? 40 minutes?
Yeah.
And it's all of them, in there. A huge finale,
And
enormous finale.
Abrams did a copy and paste on that.
This was just it kind of farted out.
Yeah, I think he tried the same thing though. It was the same idea. Everyone just turns up at the end.
Yeah, but it's just tacked on. There wasn't any
No, it was. I agree.
narrative bring, but it's come on, the spoilers by the way if you've not seen the new film. But the Emperor, Palpatine, he spent God knows how long making this massive army, and we never get to see it, in action. They all just sit there, on the terrace.
Yeah, but then also, why have they been underground all this time? Yeah, I mean, the thing with that last one is I felt that, and actually this comes back to the Marvel model, and why Disney didn't implement this at the time, I don't know. So I don't know, did you follow how the scripts were put together?
No.
So they didn't have a plan. They
Right.
didn't have a plan for the 3 films when they started. So Abrams did the first one. I think they had Kasdan as well, didn't they? Write the first one with him, who did episode
Lawrence
5.
Kasdan, yeah.
Yeah.
Was it
And
Lawrence Kasdan?
Yeah,
Lawrence
yeah.
Kasdan.
But they didn't have a plan. So apparently, Abrams has in an interview, I don't know if it's the Vanity Fair one, but he has admitted all of this. He has stated this. All he had, essentially, was some notes for where he wanted the story to go. He passed that off to Rian Johnson, and he basically threw it away. So he was like, you know what, I'm going to turn this whole thing on its head. So Snoke wasn't meant to die, all this sort of things. Yeah, Snoke wasn't meant to die. There was actually a general treatment. I mean, first of all, Lucas wrote a treatment, but then also Abrams had something. And I'm sure it probably wasn't great, but Johnson was like, we're going to throw it all out. And The Last Jedi bombed so badly that they then...
It didn't bomb. How did that film bomb badly?
Well, it didn't go down well with the fans.
Right, but it didn't not make money.
The thing is,
I bet it still made a profit. Did it still make a profit?
It definitely made a profit.
100%.
Mate, no, it'd be bigger news if it didn't make a profit, absolutely. But it didn't go down well. And
Star Wars fans felt goaded by that film.
Well, the problem
They
was
felt teased.
even the most recent one has done even worse. And you sort of think, well, that's got to be attrition rates of the audience because Even I had fatigue. I love Star Wars, and I had fatigue, and I thought, I just can't. Well, I'll turn up anyway. But that last one then was basically Abrams, and I think they initially had this Colin Trevorrow.
They should have kept him.
They should have kept him, and they've leaked the script, and I think the script was a great ending because it actually integrated.
Really? What happened?
What happened essentially was that they went back to Sidious's master. So it was the granddaddy, but it was like it was actually from old canon novels and stuff,
right.
Existing storylines. I can't remember the details, but first of all, Rey gets a double-ended lightsaber, which makes a hell of a lot of sense.
Like Darth Maul.
Given that she had a staff initially. I mean,
right,
I can't remember
just
all the
little
details,
linkages that would have made it, yeah.
but it actually integrates The Last Jedi. Love it or hate it, I didn't like it. Doesn't matter what I think. They integrated that and The Force Awakens, so 7 and 8 actually came together to an ending. Instead, they brought back Abrams, and Abrams decided he was going to try and ham-fist his ending into it, and so you had a lot
exactly.
of...
he was vocal about how pissed off he was about what Rian Johnson did, and then,
yeah, I mean, they were
then
undoing...
later he came back and was like, oh, actually, no, he didn't really screw it up.
Well, that was him being a bit shitty, because he was like, no, a lot of things worked out quite well for us in the end.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a lot of him basically undoing everything Rian Johnson had done, and then even things like Luke's ghost stepping out of the wreckage and catching the lightsaber as Rey was throwing it, as Luke had done in The Last Jedi, catching it and going, you don't treat this weapon that way, have more respect. But anyway, that's
that was a little dig, little jab.
Yeah, there's a lot of those.
But that's the thing, it's like everybody was pissed off about that Luke in The Last Jedi, but the Luke in The Last Jedi I thought was a little bit like the Yoda in Empire Strikes Back. It wasn't important. Like, it really felt like, when Yoda in Empire Strikes Back's trying to get him to free his mind and forget all these things. It's just kind of his way of doing it.
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe. We can agree to disagree on that one.
Exactly. Yeah. It's just personal preference, isn't it?
It is. For me, I don't know how you feel about this. For me, Star Wars exists in the mind of George Lucas.
Yeah.
And so I know the fan base, they love all this extra canon, all of these extra novels and TV series. And I've been watching The Mandalorian.
So good.
Really, really good. But for me, it's George Lucas. If it comes out the mind of George Lucas, it's Star Wars. So for me, I'm firmly 1 to 6 in terms of how I view it.
Yeah, me too.
And the original trilogy, I think, is fascinating from a storytelling perspective and how he put them together, because it was one of the forerunners of a certain type of narrative structure that we've just seen repeated over and over again.
Yeah, that is a good point. And watching them back, it was well done for the time, but it was just kind of out there, man. It was all digital, was all video, was all polished.
And you can say the same things for the prequels. When you say it's all green screens and that's the problem. Yeah, it was the problem with it, but at least he was a forerunner in some sense, trying new things.
Yeah.
Made a lot of mistakes that filmmakers could learn from.
It was pioneering, though.
Yeah.
That's it.
You've always got to hand him that. Yeah. He said, we're going to be the first ones to strip away everything the actors have to go off and see what happens.
Well, we found out.
Yeah, we've run that experiment.
We found out. Well, they're actually getting better at it now,
yeah,
with the Avengers stuff. But it's a combination of the two. Like anything in life, it's a combination of two factors that you get it best.
Yeah.
The
middle way.
The middle way.
Say.
Exactly.
Joseph Campbell, Vladimir Props.
All
contemporaries, I believe.
They're all around at the same time, aren't they?
All around the same time. And
what did George Lucas have to do with Campbell?
So he was one of his mentors in some sense. Campbell was one of Lucas's mentors, and he essentially took Campbell's work and applied it to Star Wars. So it's quite instructive. So Joseph Campbell is the guy who's responsible for this hero's journey. You might have heard, you will have heard it, but listeners may have heard of the hero's journey and the typical narrative structure. A bit like how songs have the same 4 chords, or a lot of the pop songs have the same 4 chords. Well, a lot of stories have that same narrative structure. And it really proceeds through a certain number of predictable steps. And, for example, it's the call to adventure at the beginning. It's the refusal of that call. It's the supernatural aid who comes in and opens their eyes, and then there's the crossing of the threshold. So there's all of these steps.
Right.
And
that need to go into,
yeah. Yeah. And so Star Wars, because Lucas took basically this call to adventure. Sorry, this hero's journey from Campbell, which has 17 steps. He basically just constructed Star Wars based on that. So you can write Star Wars predictably into every step on that journey. And you can see exactly what he was doing. It's quite formulaic. It's a bit upsetting sometimes when you look at it like that.
No, but it's awesome. That's what gives us archetypes, and that's why stories like these resonate for so long. It's because they do hit those points. That's what people identify with. They don't know people break up stories. I mean, obviously stories have evolved over time, but like Campbell, I mean, he took from all over the world, didn't he? Different narrative structures to kind of understand how they were comprised and put together.
Yeah.
And it's when you say the call to adventure, who calls that person to adventure?
Well, let's think about episode 4, for example.
Okay.
So the original.
It's a good example, yeah.
Yeah, the original, the first one. The hero in the sense...
A New Hope.
A New Hope. And the hero, the New Hope, is Luke. Luke Skywalker. And the call to adventure is, of course, from Princess Leia. So he gets this call to adventure because she's nested a message in a droid that he's now picked... R2-D2. That he's now picked up at a junkyard sale, essentially. And now suddenly there's this message calling Obi-Wan Kenobi, who he thinks may be, something to do with this Ben Kenobi, this person he happens to know.
Old Ben.
Is this the same guy? And so anyway, there's this call to adventure. Then R2-D2 sneaks off into the night, and so it starts to kind of begin from there. There's this call to adventure.
Yeah, that's interesting because there's a guy called Vladimir Prop, a Russian folklorist from the 1920s, and he wrote a book called The Mythology of the Fairy Tale, where he did a similar thing. Broke the fairy tale down into its various components and how there's always recurring characters, and he has a bunch of character types, and what you're describing fits in well with his character type, the Dispatcher.
Right.
So the Dispatcher is R2-D2 in this case, and he lands very close to the hero, also Luke Skywalker, lands quite close to the home with a message. So this is the call to adventure. The Dispatcher is the one who in Prop's case, that calls the hero to adventure.
And I'm going to make a point here, just because I think it's worth going through this, but one of the things that I found really interesting, and we've spoken about this in kind of, let's say, adjacent ways to this, is that psychology can tell you really specific things about specific instances, when we talk about scientific psychology. And then there's this whole other area, like psychodynamics, psychoanalysts, the work that they do. It's much more narrative. It's much more archetypal.
Right.
And so actually Jung inspired Joseph Campbell, who inspired Lucas. So a lot of Carl Jung's work, and actually, let's go back a step further, Freud's work was taken by Carl Jung. Carl Jung...
What time frame is Carl Jung?
Carl Jung is the early part of the 20th century.
Sweet. Same as Prop.
Yeah. Early to mid. But so what you've got here is essentially... let's just think about the call to adventure. So Cass Sunstein is a psychologist's favourite... Goodness me, the gin's already taking effect. I think I've always got that line in every podcast. The gin's already kicking in. No, so a famous behavioural economist. He wrote a book on Star Wars, funnily enough. And he was one of the guys that worked with people like Richard Thaler. You might have heard about the nudge units. So, if you're opted in by default to pension contributions, you will submit pension contributions. Funnily enough.
The nudge. It's more like the drop.
The nudge. And he's written a few books. They're all basically nudge rewritten in a particular way. And Star Wars really feels the same way. So when he talks about Star Wars, he says people like Rey and Luke, they have a status quo bias.
Yes.
And it's like, okay, fine. What does that tell me? Nothing. They've got a status quo bias. Fine. That's one specific instance. And he has this for everybody. He has this for, the Emperor, for example, is overly optimistic, and his expectations are too high. It's all this sort of thing. It's all these biases tell you specific instances. Whereas something like Joseph Campbell's narrative structure tells you about the call to adventure. Call to adventure is the status quo bias, because the next step is the refusal of call. Because Luke has a status quo bias.
Yeah. They always have to be convinced somehow.
They have to be convinced. And I just thought this was interesting because there's two types of psychology that you see out there. There's that narrative structure. There's that Carl Jung, the psychodynamics. How do your thoughts move from one to another, based on narratives? And Jung would call it the collective unconscious. What sort of things have been almost pre-programmed into us by society? What sort of what sort of things do we expect?
Mm.
What sort of narratives do we expect based on all the fairy tales that we've had growing up? And then you've got scientific psychology that says there's a status quo bias. So we're not like a novelty aversion. So I don't know, but it's quite interesting. So call to adventure, refusal of the call. So on that point, that is, he wants to go and help with the harvest. He doesn't want to be going out on an adventure. But the supernatural aid is Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Obi-Wan Kenobi, in terms of prop, is the donor. So the donor is a character who's a helper. He prepares the hero for the quest, and he often imparts some kind of magical object or something that's essential for success in the quest. In this case, it's the lightsaber. He gives Luke the lightsaber, and that's the donor, Obi-Wan Kenobi in props types.
Right, so Campbell calls him the mystic.
The mystic.
So yeah, opens his eyes to the Force, gives him the lightsaber.
That's interesting because in props character types, there is one called the Oracle, who is an older wise figure, usually male, who provides essential wisdom. So Obi-Wan could very well encompass both those character types.
He could do.
Both the donor and the Oracle.
Then, Joseph Campbell has these 3 stages. So we've just talked about separation. Separation from the known world. Then we move into the initiation. So we have to cross the first threshold. Mm-hmm. So we escape Tatooine, the desert planet that Luke is on. Then
Does he go into how they do that? How they escape?
How they escape?
Yeah.
Not specifically.
Because there is a character in props that does. It's called the Helper.
Right.
And he's basically a hero seeker. He's kind of brave, strong, young.
Okay.
And like he's quick to accept the task, and he helps the hero. You know what I mean? He gives him support through the quest, and that's Han Solo.
That's interesting.
In this case, than Chewbacca.
I like that distinction because they don't have that, or Campbell doesn't have that. And I was thinking sometimes when he's talking about the hero, I think definitely Han Solo actually is what's in that space. So that's interesting that there's that distinction.
That's a cool one, the Helper.
Yeah.
Because if I think in different movies other than Star Wars, the Helper's always quite a cool character. You know, you've got the kind of righteous hero, but then you've got his sidekick, who's always a little bit wittier.
Yeah. A
little bit more on the edge, a little bit more fringe.
In the new one, that's Poe Dameron.
Yeah, exactly.
Han Solo in the originals. But yeah, they cross the threshold. They enter the belly of the whale. Right, so they get
Pinocchio style.
Pinocchio style. They get caught in the tractor beam, pulled into the Death Star. So they're in the belly of the whale, in the belly of the beast. Then there's the Road of the Trials. So that's the daring rescue of the princess.
Yeah, exactly. That's a type as well, the princess, because she needs saving from the Empire. In the story, though, in props character types, the princess is kind of the prize for the hero, generally. Yeah. But that's not really the case in Star Wars. In Star Wars, for Luke, it's more the Force, isn't it? Learning the Force, that's more the princess. And also, Leia in the subsequent movies, she doesn't really take that role. So it's really only in Episode 4 that she is, but only really in the sense that she has to be rescued from Darth Vader. They have to break her out.
And they certainly, Han Solo thinks she might be the prize.
Yeah,
she but soon puts him right.
He's not the hero.
No.
He's the helper in this case.
The interesting thing is Campbell had a Catholic upbringing, and he actually had this idea. There's the stage coming in a minute of the temptation, and that is this temptress, which would be the princess. Had this idea that the princess would be the temptress, would tempt. But George Lucas really reinterpreted that. But yeah, so you have the Road of the Trials. That's the daring rescue. They meet with the goddess. So, of course, that's Leia. And actually, interestingly, she's wearing white. And in earlier scripts, she was a sister of a mystic order. So, a little bit different to a princess. Then there's a temptation. Now, I didn't know how to interpret the temptation here. For me, it was Han Solo was tempted away from the hero's path because the temptation is being tempted away from the path.
Yeah.
Because he, at this point, is just talking about money. He just wants money. He just wants to get paid and go home. Or not go home, but go back on his, smuggling runs. So I thought, well, maybe this is the temptation, because when they're in the belly of the whale, in the Death Star, he's just like, well, I'll get paid when I get her off this ship. So
are we talking about Han Solo? Or are we talking about the hero?
Yeah, well, that's what I mean about the hero. So I now have to jump to Han Solo, because there is no temptation, really, of Luke at this point. Not between meeting with the goddess and the next bit, which is the atonement with the father, which is essentially Obi-Wan and Vader.
That could be linked to temptation. Because the temptation is the dark side.
Yeah,
temptation runs all the way through the film, really, because even Obi-Wan says that he was tempted to the dark side. You know, there is that. It's more of a looming temptation rather than something to take off course.
Yeah, I didn't see any temptation
The
in
only
that
thing
part
that
of the
might
film for
take
Luke.
Han Solo off course is the fact that he's got a price on his head.
Well, he
He's
comes
maybe
off the course
untrustworthy.
and comes back onto his own little sort of hero's journey, because he comes back in at the end and goes, surprise, I'm actually back on the path of righteousness. So I thought
Right.
maybe that's for Han
So
Solo.
maybe Luke's not the hero.
I was unsure.
It's an interesting one.
Because then we have the atonement with the father.
Right.
So Vader confronts his father in a sense. His father figure, his master was Obi-Wan Kenobi. So actually it's now Vader versus Obi-Wan. And then you've got Luke observing his father figure, which is Obi-Wan Kenobi. At this point he doesn't know, and actually at this point Lucas hasn't even written it in or thought about the fact that Vader is his father. So that's something for later on. But you've got somebody watching a father figure fight their son figure. So it's just two father figures going on in a scene.
And it's interesting because he says, you know, if you strike me down now, I become more powerful than you can imagine.
Yeah.
And in a way that's true, because he does take power over Luke's mind then. He does become more powerful.
Yeah. He becomes a martyr.
Yeah.
It's a symbol. And the next stage is apostasis, which is essentially, I'll read the actual definition here. It's when someone dies a physical death or dies to the self to live in spirits. They move beyond the pairs of opposites to a state of divine knowledge, love, compassion, and bliss. So really, this is when Obi-Wan gets struck down and becomes the Force goes to spirits.
Yeah.
The ultimate boon. So the ultimate boon is essentially when you complete the quest. And actually, the point of the quest thus far, and really the point of the quest in the whole film, isn't the whole thing about the Death Star at the end. It's rescuing Leia, because that was the whole call to adventure.
Exactly.
So that's the ultimate boon. They get her off the Death Star. And then there's the refusal of the return. So he's not going home. He's not going back to the known world. He's not going back to Tatooine.
I'm staying here.
I'm staying here. I'm going to help.
Yeah.
I'm going to fight.
Like in Stargate, when he stays behind. You know,
I haven't
there's-
watched a lot of Stargate. Is that what he does? He stays behind.
Oh, the movie of Stargate. It's
Yeah, I
a
know.
classic.
Oh, isn't there not a TV series for that as well?
Well, yeah, it came after the movie. It was inspired by the movie.
Oh, I didn't know that. So I've only really seen the TV
Yeah.
stuff.
It's Roland Emmerich, the guy who directed The Day After Tomorrow. It's one of his early action ones.
Oh, is it?
Oh, it's class. They discover the Stargate, go back to ancient Egypt, and it finishes like that. You know, the nerd, the physicist nerd who
Yeah.
made it all happen is like, you know, he's found a really hot, like, Egyptian woman who, like, digs him, and he's like, nah, I'm going to stay here, man. I'm staying behind. You know, Kurt Russell goes home. But out of Joseph Campbell's, because I've got a couple here that I've not heard you mention in that context, so it'd be interesting if there's any parallels. So there's also the false hero in props character types. This is someone who takes credit for the hero's actions or tries to marry the princess. So is there an
That's got to
example
be
of
Han
that?
Solo, surely. I mean, that's more in episode 5, isn't it? In
Yeah, but
episode
he doesn't
5.
take credit for
Yeah.
Luke's actions.
No. There's not really anyone there that does that.
Not in Star Wars.
No.
The magical helper helps the hero in the
That's
quest,
Obi-Wan.
usually less good looking or clever, but essential to the success.
If he's magical, it's got to be Obi-Wan.
But Obi-Wan's both the donor.
He's all of them, mate. Obi-Wan,
He's
he's
loads, isn't he?
he's the princess as well to me.
Oh, is he?
Love Obi-Wan.
Yeah.
Okay, so I don't think there's a less Jar Jar Binks in the prequels, but no.
No, there's not even in the new ones like a false hero. They don't do that. They're not like stabbing each other in the back, are they?
No. Very wholesome.
Yeah.
No.
It's like a fraternity or something.
Any more?
Not from prop in terms of character types, no.
No. I mean, just to round that off, the magic flight is the return. So now we've gone back all the way around. This is now the end. We've got the return to the normal world, which actually is another climax. It's like a second climax. It's just as adventurous. The magic flight, which is their launching onto the Death Star. You know, they've got the X-Wings all going to assault the Death Star with the plans. They can try and blow it up. The rescue from without, or basically the rescue, the hero's rescued by people other than himself.
Right.
So that's in two ways. First of all, Han Solo comes back around and says, "Surprise, I'm back," in the Millennium Falcon, takes out the TIE fighters behind him, including Vader, who were trying to kill him. And Obi-Wan also appears at the last moment and says, "Luke, remember, the Force," and does this. And so he kind of has a bit of a moment, a bit like in Rey in the new ones.
Himself.
Yeah, centers himself.
That
And
was
then-
the only thing that was cool about the new one, when all the voices of all the old Jedi like line up behind her. You know?
Yeah, apparently there were scenes shot for that sounded legit, but they got cut in the edits. But yeah,
It was shot.
apparently, yeah, they got Hayden Christensen, from the prequels who did Anakin, and you had everything. There were actually apparently, visuals to that just got turned into audio cues. It's a shame, really, isn't it?
It really is. It really is. It would have been nice to see Obi-Wan pop up at least once. Like, one of the most important characters in the entire series doesn't even get a sniff in any of the new movies until that voice thing at the end.
Well, yeah, he's
That
a number
was kind of
7. There's a voice in number 7 as well for a split second.
Yeah, but a voice,
Yeah.
it's just a bit meh. Anyway.
But yeah, and then the last 3, crossing the return threshold, so they retain the wisdom gained on the quest, it says, integrating that wisdom into a human life and blah, blah, blah. Basically, he takes the Force and makes it real, applies it. He applies the Force, brings it into the real world, that wisdom that's been given to him. The next stage is he becomes the master of the 2 worlds. Right? So
What, in that film?
Yeah, well, this is it. So actually for this is the beginning of his road to becoming a Jedi.
Yeah.
So he has now really used the Force to achieve this impossible shot with this missile, blown up the Death Star. And he's now on this new path. And the last stage is freedom to live, which is obviously the celebration. It's everyone's free to live, and they've all got a bit of breathing space for a moment because they've just blown up the Death Star and haven't been destroyed by it. So that's kind of the 17 stages. And that's
But
episode
what's
4.
the prize at the end?
Well, the prize at the end, at least in Joseph Campbell's thing, really the prize is the boon, and that kind of comes 2/3 of the way through, so that's saving Leia.
Right,
And then the prize, so to speak, is the return to the normal world, which is not being killed.
Right.
In this case. So it's kind of twofold. You've got the boon, he calls it, and then you've got the return to the normal world. So that's Joseph Campbell's interpretation, really, of myths.
That's so cool. Like, the interpretation of myths is an important thing,
Yeah.
really. And it could be quite important when we think about the differences between the Jedi and the Sith.
Yes. Yeah, so I mean, it's an interesting one. I was thinking about this. The Force just is, right? I was looking at this because the funny thing is, if you look at the Jedi and the Sith and the light and the dark side of the Force, Lucas always talks about the Force as it's basically just a placeholder for faith. The Force is this thing that in our lives is religion, it's divinity. It's very practical in the Star Wars world. But when you look at the dark side...
Yeah, you can use that shit in Star Wars universe. You
Yeah.
like suck laser beams out of the sky.
The funny thing is that you always think about there's a light side of the Force and the dark side of the Force.
Yeah.
Really, it's just basically the behaviours. It's the behaviours that make use... It's how you make use of it. So actually there is no light and dark side of the Force. It's just interpretations of how people are using the Force, if that makes sense, in that universe at the very least. So the light side is just basically not using it to attack people, really. And not using it emotionally and ultimately tyrannically. And then the dark side is using it for all of those things. And but the Force itself doesn't have to be light or dark. It doesn't have to be defined in that way. So it's not that you've got the Sith who use the dark side and then everybody else, or the Jedi, because the Jedi are on this other extreme. They only use it one way.
Right, yeah. Or so you're led to believe.
Also, you're led to believe. So, because there's an interesting thing here about the Sith. They're painted as the baddies.
Yeah.
And you can do a revisionist history on this. It might be worth first. I mean, so most people, one of the most famous... That's the gin. One of the most famous quotes from Star Wars is by Yoda in the first episode. He says, "Fear is the path to the dark side.
Yep.
Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering." Is he correct? Well, and also, who's he talking about? So the interesting thing here is Lucas really, he's really interested in Eastern mysticism, Buddhism, because this is what Campbell's interested in. He's taken a lot of this from Carl Jung. So this is all basically hit Star Wars in a real amalgamated way. It's not one clear idea, but if you think about the Buddha has these 4 noble truths, and it's basically like a prescription, and it sounds so similar.
For
Sounds
sure, it's
so
a
similar.
prescription for life.
Yeah.
And you can really actually apply it.
Yeah,
It's
and you don't
pretty
need
practical.
the Force.
It's because it's not very abstract.
Well, not in the Chinese interpretation. If you talk about Zen And Chinese Buddhism, it's not. It's very practical. So basically, it's a diagnosis. So they call it dukkha, which is suffering. The diagnosis is suffering. But actually, when we say suffering, it's not just, you're feeling a bit grim. It's not just suffering. Actually, it could mean, for example, imagine a husband and wife are arguing. That's the most obvious one. It's like the suffering of the husband and wife, and it's the suffering of the wider community. But it could also be like, imagine if an archer missed their shots. That's dukkha. And if a wheel isn't joined properly at the axis, and there's a bump, and the chariot's not quite going properly, that's dukkha, that's suffering. So when we say suffering, it's not, but there's suffering. Things are not quite right. That's the diagnosis.
That's very interesting that you say that. I've just got this book here called The Psychology of Hate.
Just got a book called The Psychology of Hate. Wow.
Well, it was quite useful when thinking about this.
That's a
actually.
thick book, actually.
And there's an interesting line of events here that in this model that he paints out that's kind of similar to what you just said. It's like you have an event. So say like your wife is critical of you.
Yeah.
That's the event. And then you've got the interpretation of the event. So I think that she thinks I'm a nobody. Then I've got this distressed feeling. So I feel belittled, weak, and hurt. And then that leads to what he calls, or this person calls, I'll get their name in a second, a secondary interpretation, which is that of victimhood.
Yeah.
And then that leads to a hostile impulse, which is anger and the urge to punish her. Then we have the permission giving, she deserves it. You convince yourself somehow she deserves it. And then an action whereby he hits her in this model. So I thought that actually sounded quite similar to what you just described.
Yeah, it is. It is. Certainly the starting point is quite similar. If you think about the husband and wife arguing and the suffering that comes from that, and that's the diagnosis.
Exactly.
That's the diagnosis. Interestingly, the Buddha kind of has an etiology as well. What's the cause of that suffering? And he talks about the thirst, or the grasping, the desire.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how that necessarily fits into that example of the psychology of hate, but it's an interesting one to consider.
Well, that was just in line with what you were saying about the husband and wife. It reminded me of that model and the escalation of certain things and how the internal interpretation can lead to a particular action.
Yeah. I think we all know that
could
feeling.
Could be vengeful or it could be, there's many ways that could go.
Yeah.
But that's certainly one path. And it's in line, in a way, with the differences between the Sith and the Jedi. You have a rumination on the past with one and dwelling of the bad, but
that's the question, isn't it? So does fear lead to the dark side? Because but the Buddhists would say it is actually the thirst and the grasping, constantly trying to lock things down, control, which the Sith are known to try and control things. The Sith, at least in the films, they control the Empire, which is about control and order.
Yes.
And order tends towards tyranny. Right? And so this is where the Four Noble Truths, basically, I started to see those connections, and you sort of see where Lucas is going with that. And of course, the treatment is the path, the Tao. It's going to Nirvana, and there's this eightfold path. That's neither here nor there, but essentially, there's a point here. The Buddhists talk about the middle way, and that's what we don't see in Star Wars.
No, you see the extremes. The Jedi are supposed to be the ultimate good. The Sith are supposed to sort of be the ultimate bad. Yeah.
And funnily enough, there's a line in episode 3. They go, "Only a Dith."
Only a Sith.
Only a Dith. Only a Sith deals in absolutes.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly enough, they both seem to be absolutes. They seem to be on one end of a scale. Because so if you think about the middle way, what is the middle way? The middle way isn't necessarily just not being too far left, too far right on your bicycle, and just being in the middle. It's not just a compromise. It's also when you start to fall to the right. Let's say you steer into it. You steer into the right. It's very counterintuitive, but if you think about emotions, the middle way in Buddhism is almost that you go with the emotion. You don't resist it. You don't cause an internal contradiction. You don't try and reframe it as something else or vanquish it with a similar emotion, which cognitive behavioral therapy tries to do. It says, let's rationalize this and reframe it. No. And there's an interesting study on this about fear. So fear is the path to the dark side, allegedly. So how should you deal with that? So there's a study, 3 groups of people, they're all scared, really scared of spiders. They came like in the top percentiles on this questionnaire. The 2012 study.
Spiders are fucking horrible, man.
Yeah.
They are.
Well,
they're incredible because nature's incredible, but they're horrible and terrifying.
Incredibly horrible. Yeah, is what they are. Well, this was a Chilean rosehead tarantula, which is like the ones with the little black bits on the end of the legs,
Mm.
whites in their eyes, that sort of thing.
God, yeah, exactly. They got pupils.
Yeah, they got pupils, biceps and triceps rippling.
They're looking
their
at you
legs.
like a pissed guy on whiskey.
Yeah.
You know? It's like,
And so they were asked basically to touch this thing. You know, there was like so many steps. You had to go near it, then touch it. And there were 3 different treatment conditions. One was basically when you thought about the spider, you had to describe your emotions. So you might say, I feel anxious. You say it out loud. You say, I feel anxious about the disgusting tarantula and it'll jump on me and all the rest of it. The other condition is that you try and revise or basically reevaluate the spider. So you go, looking at the little spider is not dangerous for me. You start rationalizing why it's not dangerous. And the third condition is you try and distract yourself. You try and think about what's for dinner. You know? And so they're all touching it. They're all going through the same steps. And they did this, 3 different times, including a week later. And they found that really, if you actually state your emotions, well, none of them, first of all, none of those 3 conditions felt any less scared. They all rated themselves exactly the same. They said, I'm still just as scared as I was last week. Fine. What happened was that they were also measuring the sweat on their palms. They were basically measuring how sweaty their palms got. And the physiological marker of sweating palms drastically, significantly reduced in those that were stating their emotions. And it's thought, the theory behind those results is that it gets to you at the level of your amygdala. So not your frontal lobe.
Okay, so
not
right down there.
Right down there. So we're not talking about, the conscious you sitting on the top of your head, doing all the rationalising, the rational bit at the front.
The
We're talking
stuff.
Yeah, not the top-down stuff. We're talking the deep amygdala stuff, the stuff in the limbic system, the emotional centre of the brain, the stuff that happens subconsciously before you're even aware of it. You know, when you're in a darkened room and something moves behind you, your amygdala sees that first and goes, what the hell was that? And then you realise it was a dressing gown. That's your amygdala. And that's the level it's operating on. And so it's really important you sort of say this is because cognitive behavioural therapy basically relies on this reappraisal, rationalise it. But actually, it's more like mindfulness. Be with the emotion. Steer into the emotion, like Buddhists say. And you will reduce those physiological fears. You'll reduce it at a really deep level.
Yeah, you do have to go with it. You can't, like, swim against a river.
No, precisely.
If you think about Buddhism, you can't swim against it. You've got to go with the power of the river. And then you get the power of the force of the river.
Yeah. And so, let's just state it. What are the Jedi? They say, remember, concentrate on the moment, feel, and don't use your instincts. That's Qui-Gon Jinn. The Sith, Count Dooku, he says to Anakin, I've sensed great fear in you, Skywalker. You have hate, you have anger, but you don't use them, because emotions make them powerful. And in some of the other stuff outside of the films, you have grey Jedi. Those who use both sides, but don't succumb to the dark side. So that's how it's defined in Star Wars.
But it's interesting because, fear leads to anger.
Yes.
So anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. Yeah, and suffering. So fear is the path to the dark side by those means. Those are the steps. Yeah. So presumably, first you've got to be afraid of something. Secondly, probably that fear response results in anger towards whatever perpetrated that fearful response. Then I guess, if justice isn't found or something, then you get hate.
Yeah, through that injustice comes hate.
And then you have the suffering. But it's interesting because in Buddhism, you just will suffer. This is the thing. There is no, leading to suffering. Yeah. Suffering is the first noble truth. You just are going to do it. So it's interesting, you have Star Wars splits that in two, in a way. That there is actually a choice, you don't have to. In actual real Buddhism, no, you're gonna. It's just a reality. Yeah. But the Jedi are supposed to be all good and supposed to be all great, and the Sith they're the baddies, man. They use the dark side for this thing. But like you say, it's like, I see much fear in you, much anger, like the Emperor says to Anakin, right? But probably the Emperor has learned a lot from the Jedi. Because what we know, because the Jedi have become incredibly successful, according to the lore of Star Wars, the Jedi won in the Old Republic, the Wars of the Old Republic and stuff like that against the Sith. But really the Sith are their own making. And so the Emperor knows that if you use those things, you become all powerful, and he probably got that impression because the Jedi used that against the Sith. Yeah. That exact thing. And it's because I didn't know anything about this background lore. This must be all stuff that's been written around the trilogy. But apparently, I was wondering if you could look at the Sith and try and understand why they use the dark side and have made that a priority.
Because they seem to have a rationale.
Right. And it's not just the rationale, it's that it's an ingrained like cultural thing. You know, it becomes a way of life. And so I wondered if you could I recently read Outliers. Have you read Outliers, Malcolm Gladwell?
I think I've read it a long time ago.
Yeah. But it's brilliant because what he does is if you look at the way a particular culture behaves, you have to kind of track it back. Like, you have to find its lineage, its migration across the world, and understand why it would behave in certain ways. So he talks about certain cultures in America in the Midwest that are really linked to honor cultures from the borders of Scotland. You know, and how you can explain a lot of behaviors in the Midwest because of farming. You know, in this particular land. Wonder if you could do that with the Sith. So what I found out was that the Jedi, you know, they're not all squeaky clean in this whole thing. Because if you remember, episode 1 actually is a pivotal episode because Yoda says that, but also Darth Maul says at some point, at last we will reveal ourselves to the Jedi. At last we will have our revenge.
Revenge for what?
Right. So apparently, according to the lore, there are a bunch of Jedi that our Jedi, the good Jedi, didn't like. And they called them the Dark Jedi. And they outcast them, they exiled them from Jedi society. And they sent them to this planet called Coruscant. Right? And when they landed on Coruscant had a bunch of people living there. And they were called the Sith, apparently, according to the lore.
Okay.
And it's not that they were bad or anything. They just had a connection with the dark side. You know, much like a fish that sucks sulfur off the seabed, you know. You know, that would kill us, that kind of diet, but it's not bad. That's just how it lives. You know, that's the energy that kind of powers it. And they're not really affecting anyone. And then over the years, these supposed dark Jedi, you know, it could become ingrained in Sith culture, and then it becomes the Sith. Right. But then there's the wars. There's these wars, apparently, of the Old Republic, and the Jedi win. But the Jedi still are paranoid about the Sith. They're evil, they're terrible, they're arseholes. Yeah? They don't use the Force in the right way. We've got to kill them all.
So they ride in and say you're not living correctly. Sounds very similar. Well, that's got parallels, isn't it?
Interesting, isn't it? Considering they're the Old Republic and they're the biggest force in the galaxy. Yeah. You know? So they come in and they just commit a mass genocide of the Sith. They take out everyone, not just the armies and all stuff like that. Everything, women, children, the lot, take them all out. But a few survive, and they don't. They run away to deep space and they hide. And then that's where it festers. That's where Palpatine starts to fester this hatred. So it's interesting if we think of that, and that's maybe why Yoda's making that statement, because Yoda's very middle way.
He is, yes.
So it's he doesn't really fall down on a side. He just sees what's happening and deals with it when it comes, you know.
So when he talks about fear, and he talks about that process.
Right. So he knows that has happened with the Sith under the Jedi. Yeah. So he's so maybe that's tying into that and stuff. So so you have this fear, and the fear leads to anger against it, but they're so isolated that it turns into hate. So it's interesting to think about hate. Yeah. What is hate?
And is it ever justified? And is revenge ever justified? What path out? What are there really? Realistically?
Is it. So I think, you know, to really think about it, if the Jedi commit genocide, you have to think about how they're viewed the Sith to do that to them. And so there's a guy called Staub, and I got this again from this book, The Psychology of Hate. It's a good book. It's basically that a violent act is hateful when it's based on intense, persistent negative views of the other that give rise to the desire to do harm, make, suffer, or even destroy the other. So that's pretty evident. The Jedi did that. Yep. We could say the Jedi are pretty hateful.
Pretty hateful.
At this point. And so there's a guy called Moshman, and he talks about hate quite interestingly as well, because if a tornado comes and rips through a town, you don't hate the tornado.
No.
You accept that it's an act of nature, despite the damage it does.
There's no intent.
Right, okay. So it's not a rational agent. And so you can be angry at the the tornado, but it'd be strange to hate the tornado. And if you actually carried on hating the tornado, it'd be kind of a psychopathology, like,
Yeah,
really.
I mean, you probably could do it. You have to personify it. You would have to personify
Right.
the tornado
You'd have to give it...
and pretend it had intent.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's what Moshman says. So to hate, you need to view the hated one as a rational, enduring agent. So hatred's more of an attitude. That's what Yoda's getting at. It's not an emotion like
Yeah.
anger. Like hate is where the fear and anger become solidified
Yeah,
into
it's
an
an
attitude
Yeah.
towards something. And to hate others requires them to be viewed as causally and morally responsible for their actions in an ongoing sense. So if you're looking at the Sith, from their point of view, they've been outcast to begin with. They've gone onto a planet. They've tried to just take their bit, live their bit of the universe.
Yep.
Then they've had genocide thrown on them, and then they're kept suppressed.
Yeah.
So you can see that they feel the Jedi are ongoing and morally responsible for what's going on.
And they see them as a corrupt order. Because remember as well, the Jedi, they're not just a species of people or a race or an ideology of themselves. They're an institution. There's a Jedi Council.
Yes.
They preside institutionally over the galaxy in some sense. There's a Republic as well, but they are intertwined. They are they're advisors to the Republic politicians. So they are institutionally responsible, and there's a lot of parallels here. You think about the people that have grievances. Let's think about terrorists. They don't see themselves as the bad guys.
Right.
They in their own mind have justification.
Terrorists could view themselves very much as the rebels, the Rebel Alliance.
Well, yeah, exactly. Because one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter.
Mm-hmm.
And so, after how long? So let's say 1,000 years passes. At what point do you say, well, it's not the same Jedi? Okay, so the Jedi historically committed genocide, but the Jedi aren't the same anymore. Okay, there's two questions there. One, personally, ethically, do the Jedi, does it matter ethically? But the second thing is, do they still have the institution in place that would do the same thing if they had the chance to do it again? And actually, when you look at Episode 1, and as soon as the Jedi Council gets a sniff that there are Sith hanging about, they're dispatching people to kill them. They're sending
That's
assassins. True. So yeah, institution. So it's not just you're not just saying, well, it's been hundreds of years, and institutionally they are still sending out assassins to kill off the Sith.
But there's this interesting question. They press down so hard. It's like, the people that are coming against them, they've become, at this point, the Sith, you can't negotiate with them. They just want to come, and we're starting a war. There's no sitting down. There's no talking. The Emperor's coming. It's been too long.
Yeah.
It's too little too late.
Yeah.
And this could be to do with rumination. I did find one study by this by Berry and Everett et al. In 2005. And they did a study with the effects of dwelling, effectively, or rumination on revenge, or vengeful thoughts.
What does that do? Does it solidify these things?
Yeah, it does, the more that time goes on. Well, people do suggest it. It's like rumination on it does kind of predict revenge and not avoidance.
Okay, so the more you think about it, the more you try and calculate revenge.
Yeah, calculation.
Okay.
And if you think, the Sith, they're operating in exile for so long.
Yeah.
They've had plenty of time for this rumination to digest it. And a guy called McCulloch in 2001 suggested that some people are dispositionally more vengeful than others. And this desire for vengeance is motivated by ruminative thinking of offences. So, like, if you think of historical transgressions against a person, or against a people's, and without coming to the table, it's very possible that vengeful thoughts begin and an entire ideology against whatever it was so bad back in the past begins to gestate and find scale. That's what happened. This study used there were loads of people in this study. I don't know how many. Hang on. Like, they did 4 studies. There was 179 in the first, 233 in the next, 80 and 66 undergraduate students. And what they found was that trait forgivingness was negatively correlated with trait anger, hostility, neuroticism, fear, and vengeful rumination. and and was positively correlated with agreeableness, extroversion, and trait empathy. So, like, the more forgiving you were, the less likely you were to ruminate, and therefore harbour vengeful thoughts.
I mean, this is psychology telling us something we kind of know,
Yeah.
isn't it?
This is they use this scale. It's called the dissipation rumination scale. And what the dissipation rumination scale?
Yeah, somebody's just looking for funding, aren't they?
Like
with
from
this?
1986, this apparently, so it must be legit. My year of birth, and it's a measure of so the disposition to experience ruminative thinking explicitly related to revenge, retaliation, and desire.
Okay.
To do that. And that's what these studies were based on. They found that the disposition to ruminate vengefully mediated the relationship between trait forgiveness and anger-related traits. Both revenge motivations state anger following specific recent transgression, but it didn't mediate forgivefulness.
Okay.
Fearfulness and avoidance motivations following a specific transgression. So it didn't. Ruminative thinking does not encourage forgiveness.
The more you think about it, the less likely you are to forgive somebody.
Forgive it, absolutely.
So, if something has been transgressed upon you, stop thinking about it, just forgive.
Well, that's it. It's like, what can we take away?
Yeah.
If we're going to think about this, what can we take away from this? Yeah, exactly. Try not to ruminate too hard in isolation on the past transgressions of others, even if your planet was wiped out by a bunch of evil space monks, with glowing sticks. You just got to...
Well, just think as well, because the only way out, like you might have said, is that you can only forgive. There's no way out of it. Because if you think about, I mean, I'm not saying this is some kind of empirical experiment that's been played out over and over again, but at least in the narrative, think, the Jedi wiped out the Sith come back, eventually Palpatine comes to power.
This is it.
And exercises Order 66. So by ruminating on it and exercising his revenge, he has become the very thing that he hates. He has now committed genocide against the Jedi, to the point where there's 2 Sith left. You've got Vader and Palpatine.
Yeah, that's it.
And then you've got 1 Jedi, which is Obi-Wan Kenobi, hiding in the desert.
Yeah.
Until Luke comes along.
Yoda as well, hiding.
Oh, yeah. So there's 2 and 2. And, in the past, at least in the lore, there's thousands of each. Millions.
Yeah, right, that's true.
So, the way out is forgiveness.
Because how many are even left now? It's the only Rey.
There's only Rey, and she's got a yellow lightsaber, so I guess that means she's one of these grey Jedi.
So there you go. Unless you forgive, all is wiped out.
Yes.
There's none now. That's it. That is the balance, I guess, to the Force.
Yeah, there's none. She is the balance to the Force, yeah. Yeah, with that yellow lightsaber. And actually, just to round this off, that kind of reminds me of, we started with Lucas, and we went to Joseph Campbell and narratives, and we mentioned Jung. And actually, Jung always talks about, in psychology, in psychoanalysis, he talks about the shadow. It's this unconscious thing in all of us. It's basically, there's the ego, there's what we identify with ourselves, and there's these things that we push under the surface into our subconscious, into either our personal or there's also the collective unconscious that kind of overlaps with this. It's all these archetypes that we were talking about. All these things that inform our consciousness without us even realizing. And basically, it doesn't even have to be bad things. We talk about the shadow. It could be cowardice and carelessness. But for example, an anxious person, it could be the things that they've cast off of their ego. So their ego being who they are. It could be spontaneity and enthusiasm. That could be in their shadow self. But it's those things you've pushed away, you've repressed, pushed under the surface. And we tend to project it onto others. So the Jedi, they've pushed a lot under the surface.
Oh,
right?
yeah. They're majorly in denial.
Yeah. They've really pushed under the surface all this emotional content. They've really repressed it. They're not leaning into it. They're never doing the middle way when we talk about leaning into those emotions. No. They very much cut themselves off from it. And, you might find some examples that generally don't do that. But in general, if you get the quotes up, pretty much it's don't associate yourself with that. And
stay away, don't look at it.
Yeah. But then they look out at the world, they see the Sith, and they project onto them. And the interesting thing about Star Wars is that they literally show you the shadow. In some sense, we can analyze Star Wars in a way that we try and take it really seriously, like the revisionist history. But then also George Lucas was kind of taking Jung's ideas and he made it very literal. So Anakin and Luke, for example, Anakin is because when you think about the shadow, the idea is that you go into your unconscious, you find the shadow self,
Mm-hmm.
and you try and bring it, and you try and integrate it with your personality.
Hmm.
And it's very dangerous because the shadow could overcome you, and you
Well,
could
there
be
needs to be
subservient.
an integration, otherwise there's a split.
Yeah, it widens your consciousness, is what Jung thinks. Again, Jung is I'm not going to say widely discredited, but he's very controversial. So what I'm not saying is this is, some cold hard psychological fact. But he says it widens your consciousness to understand that you have those things inside of you. You look inside yourself and you see those things. So you see the Sith inside of yourself.
Yep.
And the Sith should see the Jedi inside of themselves and understand that there's that interplay. And
That so sounds like a song by M People.
I love them people.
You've got to search for the Sith.
The hero inside yourself. Yeah. Used to love that song. But yeah, but the idea is that when you integrate it with your personality, either the shadow can dominate or the personality, Jekyll, the conscious person can dominate, and you can integrate the shadow, and it gives you a wider perspective. And that would be the Grey Jedi. The Grey Jedi would be one that straddles both, but doesn't succumb to the darkness. So if you look at Anakin and Luke, it's very literal. Anakin is taken over by and becomes a literal representation of his shadow.
Yeah, that's very, very true.
And actually, if you think about Luke, even
He
better
does
than
come
this,
back, though, at the end, though, doesn't he?
he does come back, but this is the Luke bit, which is so interesting. So Luke, he confronts his shadow in Dagobah, on Dagobah. He goes into that cave or sort of under the tree, doesn't he? And he sees, it's a vision of Vader. He fights this kind of, this vision of Darth Vader. And when he kills him, the mask kind of blows off. And it's his own face.
Yeah.
So he actually sees his own shadow. Vader is a literal representation of Luke's shadow. So you have the consciousness, the hero, Luke, and then you have his literal shadow, which is Vader.
Well, this is going into the belly of the whale to rescue the father.
Yes, exactly. And in episode
Pinocchio
6...
style.
Yeah, Pinocchio. Gets around, doesn't he? But in episode 6, when Luke confronts Vader, he looks at his hand, actually. He looks at his hand, he looks at Vader, and he recognises those similarities. And he sees his shadow self, he sees the similarities. And, he's his father, first of all, as well. Vader is his father. So, so very similar. And it's only then that he really confronts that. And he then says, I'll never turn to the dark side. I'm a Jedi, like my father before me. And it's only at that moment that his shadow, in this case, literally Vader is his shadow, is redeemed. So it's at that moment his shadow is redeemed. And you get this coming together. So it's interesting. It may be an overanalysis, but Jung informs Campbell.
So
informs
that the
Lucas.
moment Luke refuses to go to the dark side, I'll never go to the far side, the father's redeemed.
Yes.
Because he's done his job.
He's done his job.
Right.
The literal representation of the shadow.
He's kept him away from the dark side.
Yeah.
He did what he was supposed to do, actually.
Yes.
Darth Vader's actually a pretty good dad. Think about it.
Pretty good.
He
pretty
literally kept his son on the straight and narrow. Let's face it.
He did, yeah,
Like,
by being bloody terrifying.
Stern discipline.
Yeah.
He
He had two father figures, though. He had Obi-Wan Kenobi as well.
That's true.
So that maybe gay parents are the way forward. You have two strong father figures. One terrify the life out of you,
But
and the
they're
other
not to live together.
not to live together, and one to die and come back as a ghost.
Yeah.
And just whisper in your ear all the time. What was George Lucas on about?
Well, this is it. It's like, for me, the main message of Star Wars is first, ignore all the robots that come to you bearing messages. Just ignore them. Just feel like...
That's a status quo boss,
no,
mate.
especially from royalty. If it's coming from royalty, just ignore it. And if an old bearded man approaches you, waving a glowing blue staff in your direction, yeah, ushering you to go on some wild adventure, talking shit about some mad invisible shit that's like all over and like needs balancing, yeah, don't trust him. Because like everyone you know and love will die, right?
Yeah.
That dad that you never had will turn out to be an arsehole, yeah? You'll lose your hand, you accidentally knob your own sister, and you'll die fighting your nephew who you tried to kill while he was asleep because he was fucking emo. So like, don't trust it. Just stay put. There is not better than here. You know what I mean? Just stay and chill.
Stay on Tatooine.
Stay on Tatooine, relax, just live easy.
Totally.
Thanks for listening to Abstracts. Music as always was Coffee by Cambo. That's available on the Free Music Archive. Link is in the description. For the references used in this episode and all episodes, head on over to abstractspodcast.com. That's abstractspodcast.com. Send us a message, drop us a line. Until next time, see you later. Hasta luego. Take it easy. In a bit.